I've come back to see two tiny town gardens. No, not in Venice, but in sunny Lincolnshire, in Stamford. This garden I designed about 20 years ago, and I haven't seen it for ages. And sadly, the client, Mary Napier, is no longer with us, so it has been empty for almost a year. So it's not looking how it was when she tended it. But I remember this garden well, firstly because she was a magnificent Irish client with great zest and energy for life. And secondly, because when we came, it was really very, very different. Behind me, in what looks like sunny Venice, was a big 1960s white picture window and a garage and a flat roof on top of it. And it actually dominated the whole garden. So your eye went straight to this really quite nasty picture window. So what we did is we put a bit of plywood over it, marine ply, so it lasts well, and then we rendered over the whole lot and painted the image of Venice over it. Why Venice? Because Mary loved Venice and she wanted something to remind her of it. And it's fun. And I think gardens should all be about fun. We also hid the white fascia board. That ran right across the front of it, and white stands out like nothing on earth, so it really punched out at you. So we concealed that with the lead. So that's just code 4 lead, which is like a very heavy tin foil, and you can cut it with tin snips. And that just completely changed the whole look of that flat roof. And then that together with the mural really transformed that garage. When you do trompe-l'oeils or murals on walls, you can go really big, as we've done on the back wall. But then you can pick it up and carry it through. So we've got quite simple details over the doors that really lift a very ubiquitous, sort of mundane extension that you just do the paintwork around the top of the doors, and it's just a fun detail that adds another quite dramatic touch. And when you do them, if you put a bit of PVA into the paint or paint it over the top of the paintwork, these are just acrylic paints and they still look pretty good, 20 years down the line. And I think in 20 years' time, another 20 years, I think they'll still look pretty good still. Paint effects are a very simple way that you can just add embellishments, little touches, and you can go as complicated as you want. If your artistic skills aren't very good, then you can do quite a simple motif and just repeat it. If you're good, like Martin's obviously done loads for me, and then you can go and be more adventurous. But they're a fun thing to do. And if you don't want to do anything at all tricksy and clever, you could just wash the back wall in a completely different colour and just put the odd, maybe faux balustrade along the front or something instead, but you can still do something quite simple and bring it down to your level, and it would still look quite effective. And if you foul up and do something really bad, it doesn't really matter. You can just paint over it and start again. And then the other quite dramatic thing we did was we changed the levels. This was just a sloping lawn. And again, a slope, it makes you feel so ill at ease. You're neither at the top or the bottom. You just want to get to one or the other. So we made this middle terrace with the steps still going up to the back door. Maybe you can't see it, but there is a back door in that mural where you can get access to the garage. So we haven't changed the access at all. But I thought we would make a middle level. So we made this middle terrace level because it gave you a flat surface. And again, a flat surface is very usable. We had to form the retaining wall, but this is just a rendered retaining wall, which is totally hidden by the plants. And so it was relatively inexpensive. And when you make this flat level, it's bringing it up more towards the sun, so you get lots of the evening sun here, which is all important. Much sunnier, obviously, than the level down below. But that level is very nice for breakfast and things in the morning and at the end of the day. Now the balustrade, we were at the same time, we were doing a garden for Portmeirion at Chelsea Flower Show, and they had a balcony detail just like this. So I got our local stonemason to cast me a copy of one, much cheaper than stone, in reconstituted stone, which we used for the Chelsea Flower Show and we used for here. And the same stonemason that made this for me, the balustrade out of reconstituted stone, also made the bench for me. So reconstituted stone is basically concrete with stone dust put in it, and you can colour it to almost any colour. It does weather slightly differently from stone, but it obviously costs a fraction of the price, especially when you've already got the moulds made up. And then I got Martin Rogers, who did the mural for me on the back, to copy this design of the balustrade on the back wall. The lower level, as you can see, the paving is really a very small space, and so I've laid the paving on the diagonal. I often think if you've got a tiny space and you work out the paving on the diagonal axis instead of the most obvious front to back, it makes it look more interesting and possibly a bit wider. When you do a very small unit paving in an area that's quite tiny, it does make it look bigger. If I just put big stones across the top, A, it wouldn't be so interesting, and B, it would look a lot smaller. And the paving up here, again, I played a bit of trickery with this paving up here. We put a mosaic. It's a mosaic of the family's coat of arms. And this was done by just getting a whole load of terracotta tiles and old plates and things. We put them into a cement mixer, no cement, just lots of sand, and you put it on for 2 hours, and it goes round and round and round. And smashed plates that originally go in with very sharp edges come out looking like river-washed tiles, as though they've been under the sea for 100 years. And they look much nicer in a mosaic than those sharp, cracked, freshly broken edges that you would see otherwise. We've used a lot of evergreen plants here because it's a small garden, you look at it all the time, and so you've got a good structure in the winter. But when Mary lived here, she would plant it up with lots of ephemeral flowers, lots of whites, and so it always looked full of flower. It always looked loved, it always looked well cared for. But even though she hasn't been here for almost a year, you can still see the structure. And the basic design principles of making more layers out of the levels and of having small unit paving, taking it off the axis, having something interesting on the back wall, they really apply and they still work even when the garden isn't having a lot of attention. For the front garden, we decided to go for a very simple approach. So we just drew out a knot garden on a piece of paper, and then we blew that drawing up so we had a pattern work, and then we could plant the box perfectly to make those curvaceous shapes. And then it's just mulched with gravel. So although you might think it's a lot of work, and okay, it needs clipping once, possibly with a second light clip a year, otherwise it takes very little maintenance. And I think the whole beauty of the front is that beautiful elevation of the building, and then of course the stunning view that looks out over the hills. I'm here in a tiny courtyard garden, further along in the same terrace than the other one. Now the garden here is not looking in apple pie order, but it shows how you can tackle a small space, I think, very nicely. This garden also had similar problems. The building here, instead of being a garage, is actually an office, and that was very jarring because those doors just pinged out to you in white. We just chose a nice, gentle paint colour that just makes the whole door and door frame recede, and it becomes less important. What makes a garden work, I think, is the spaces. It's all the different shapes and sizes and proportions of the spaces. And the shape was a general sort of meander. It didn't define the courtyard. And when I visited, and it must have been about 10 years ago now, I decided that we should actually make the most of this rectilinear space. And so I defined it with the pergola. Now normally you put in a pergola because you want to make a passageway through a garden or a linear walkway, but here I've used the same strategy but to define the rectangle. And I like to do this because your eye just goes up to the buildings and up to the surrounds. But if you bring it down to just above eye level, it really helps contain the space. And with the actual pergola design, I design them and then I get my chippy to make them up for me. And I like to make every design slightly different. So here I've used solid posts on the bottom and the top, and I've just done some trellis work for the middle section. And I haven't painted that. So it's just a little twist. And what I like about trellis work pergolas, whether they're metal or wood, is that the plants, if you plant them, actually twine in and out of them, and they grow really nicely and make that beautiful combination between plant and structure. Really, it's really diffused and you can't distinguish one from the other. Strangely, when you add height in a small space, it makes it more three-dimensional and it makes it seem much bigger. So I've actually emphasised the pergola by adding this stonking nice olive trees. Now, they weren't stonking nice olive trees when they were planted. They were probably about half the size. But they're in these big pots, and of course there are no bases under them, so the trees are now rooting through to the ground below. So they're really pretty healthy, and they've survived many cold winters. They're nicely trimmed so they don't get too big and overpower the space. The steps going up to the outside access, we redid those totally. I can't actually remember the configuration of how they were before, but we've made it so we've got a bin store at the top. Now, everybody's got bins and rubbish. It's a sort of thing of 21st century living. But we've screened it with a very dense trellis fence. And again, I've used the mixture of the wood, and I think I used Western red cedar, which is that goes to this nice silvery grey. And I've picked up the same soft grey-green colour that we've done on the doors and the pergola bases and the top rail. And so you can hide all your rubbish behind the bins. And then I've made a middle platform with some nice big plants on. And then we've got the lower planting level. And we've put the balustrade, a very light balustrade, on the top stretch of steps. And then we've just used the pots to form the side of the steps coming down on the right-hand side. And I think plants in pots on steps always look exciting. It's a lovely way to show off plants. So that whole shady looking corner, I think, looks very attractive. It's very simple. It takes minimal effort, really, but it just adds to the view of the garden. So you've got an interesting view that way. You've got an interesting view to the backs of the high houses, but we've just softened it with the olive trees and with the vines growing along over the pergola. Because this is such a confined space for a garden, I wanted to make it work really hard. When I came, there was just some railings which stopped you tipping over from this level into the basement garden below. So I changed that. I put a stone wall alongside where the table is now, and I put a chunky stone coping on the top, and they built a timber back, which was sort of built into the pergola as a seat back. So it sort of forms a banquette or an outside seat, and it forms part of the pergola, but it means you can just get lots of extra bottoms to the table when you're sitting and eating outside. And I think sitting spaces, when you've got lots of people outside, are really, really important. And I think built-in seating is a very easy way to accommodate a lot more sitting space. This garden has a fundamental problem which I wanted to rectify when we did it. The kitchen is actually over there, and there's no direct connection between the kitchen and the garden. And because everybody seems to live in the kitchen nowadays, it means you have to go through a series of passages to get out here. Never so easy. What I wanted to do when we did the garden was put a big glass roof outside that kitchen window and then punch through the kitchen window and make it into a door. Now you might think, what's she talking about, a glass roof? But we did this on a garden at Chelsea back in something like 2001, I think it was. We made a big platform out of a thick sheet of glass, and it was supported all the way around the edges. You could walk on top of the platform, and then you could also go underneath the platform, and you had this lovely covered space below it with lots of light bouncing in through the top. Now the client said she might want to do this because she's not quite sure what she's going to do with the property, and so that might be the next phase, which would be lovely. I mean, glass roofs are wonderful nowadays. It's extraordinary what you can do with glass. I remember the one at Chelsea was something like 6 metres wide by 10 metres long, one big sheet of glass just supported around the edges. So we could easily pop one over that space there, open out the kitchen, and then it would lead directly onto this space, which would be fantastic, and you'd have the added eating area right outside the kitchen door. You could just pop out for a coffee or whatever. I've just got to twist her arm a bit and convince her that it's the right thing to do, and then I think she will never regret it having done it.